Nestled deep in the heart of rural Pennsylvania lies a forgotten motel. Its cracked neon sign flickers faintly in the night, like a heartbeat that's been left on the brink of death. It was once a vibrant stopover for weary travelers, a beacon of warmth and safety on the desolate highway. But that was long ago. Now it's a hollow shell of its former self, a place where time seems to have stopped, except perhaps for room 217. It is in this room that a series of inexplicable and sinister events would transpire, leaving a trail of unanswered questions and shuddering fear in its wake. This is the story of that room, the stories that haunt it, and the inexplicable terror that resides within its walls. It was the summer of 1972 when the Anderson family, James, his wife Linda, and their young son Timmy checked into the motel. They were on a road trip, the kind that families take to escape the mundanity of everyday life, to reconnect, to feel the warmth of togetherness. They had no intention of staying the night, but when the storm rolled in, thunder cracking like bones in the distance, and rain pouring down in torrents, they sought refuge at the only place within miles, the now decrepit and largely forgotten Hillside Inn. The lobby was dimly lit, a single lamp casting elongated shadows across the faded wallpaper. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and something else, something metallic and unsettling. The elderly man behind the counter, who introduced himself as Mr. Grayson, offered them a room with a mechanical smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Room 217 is available," he said, sliding the key across the counter. The Andersons, too tired and wet to argue, accepted the key and headed down the long, narrow hallway. As they approached room 217, Linda hesitated. A strange chill crawled up her spine, a sense of foreboding she couldn't quite shake. The hallway was deathly silent, save for the creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet. The door to room 217 groaned as James pushed it open, revealing a room that was, at first glance, unremarkable. Faded wallpaper, a dusty old bed, and a window that looked out onto nothing but darkness. Yet, there was something off about the room, something Linda couldn't put into words. She noticed the coldness in the air, how it seemed to settle in her bones despite the stifling summer heat outside. Timmy, typically an energetic child, grew uncharacteristically quiet, clinging to his mother as they unpacked. And then there was the mirror, a large ornate piece hanging on the wall directly opposite the bed. It was an antique, the kind that might have once been beautiful but now seemed ominous, as if it were hiding something within its reflective surface. The first night passed uneventfully, or so it seemed. But it was the silence that was most unnerving, a silence so thick it seemed to smother the very air they breathed. The storm raged on outside, yet inside the room there was an unnatural stillness, as if the room existed outside of time, detached from the world in the early hours of the morning, when the storm had quieted to a steady drizzle. Linda awoke with a start. She couldn't remember what had disturbed her, a sound, a dream, or something else. She sat up in bed, her eyes drawn to the mirror on the wall. In the dim light, she thought she saw something moving in the reflection, a shadow, dark and formless, shifting just beyond the edge of the glass. Her heart raced as she stared at the mirror, trying to convince herself that it was a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination. But the shadow seemed to grow, slowly taking shape until it resembled the outline of a person, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her very soul. She gasped, reaching out to shake James awake, but when she turned to look at him, he was already sitting up, staring at the mirror with the same look of horror etched on his face. "Do you see it too?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Linda nodded, her hand trembling as she clutched the blanket to her chest. They watched in paralyzed silence as the shadow in the mirror began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if it were pacing back and forth inside the glass. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving behind only the reflection of the empty room. Neither of them slept for the rest of the night. They stayed awake, listening to the silence, their eyes never leaving the mirror. The next morning, the atmosphere in the room was even heavier. James and Linda were exhausted, their nerves frayed from the night's event. They decided to leave as soon as the rain let up, but the storm showed no signs of abating. Timmy, usually a chatterbox, remained silent, his eyes wide with a fear that belied his age. Breakfast, Mr. Grayson approached their table, his smile as mechanical as ever. "How was your night?" he asked, though there was something in his tone that suggested he already knew the answer. Linda hesitated before replying, unsure of whether to share what they had experienced, but before she could speak, Timmy blurted out, "There's a man in the mirror." The room seemed to grow colder at his words, the other patrons suddenly quiet, their faces turned away as if they hadn't heard. Mr. Grayson's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but he quickly recovered, brushing off the comment with a chuckle. "Mirrors can play tricks on the mind, especially on stormy nights," he said, though there was an edge to his voice that Linda didn't like. As the day wore on, the Andersons tried to distract themselves by exploring the surrounding area, but the storm kept them close to the motel. The oppressive atmosphere of the previous night lingered, a constant weight on their shoulders, and yet, despite their unease, they found themselves drawn back to room 217 as the day came to an end. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The mirror loomed large on the wall, its surface dark and foreboding. She considered covering it, but something stopped her. A sense of morbid curiosity, perhaps, or a need to confront whatever was lurking within its depths. The night was eerily quiet. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind an unsettling calm, but it was in this silence that the real terror began. At precisely 3:17 a.m., Linda woke again. This time, it wasn't the mirror that caught her attention, but the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the window, a slow, deliberate knock, 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 as if someone were outside, beckoning to be let in. She glanced at James, who was still asleep, then at Timmy, who had somehow ended up between them, clutching his blanket. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Linda's heart pounded as she turned to look at the window. But there was nothing there, just the darkness of the night beyond the glass. And then she saw it, a handprint smeared across the inside of the window, as if someone had pressed their hand against it from the inside. She froze, a scream caught in her throat as the handprint slowly began to fade, leaving behind only a faint outline before she could react. The mirror across the room suddenly cracked with a sharp, splintering sound. The noise jolted James awake, and they both stared in horror as the crack in the mirror widened, spider-webbing across the glass. From within the mirror, the shadow began to emerge again, this time more defined, more corporeal. It was no longer a vague outline, but a figure, a man, tall and thin, his features obscured by the darkness, but his presence unmistakable. He stepped out of the mirror, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Linda and James were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak as the figure approached them. It stopped at the foot of their bed, its head tilting slightly as if observing them. And then, in a voice that was both distant and intimate, it spoke. "They never leave." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and walked back into the mirror, disappearing into the fractured glass. The room fell silent once more, the crack in the mirror slowly beginning to mend itself until it was as if nothing had happened. But the handprint on the window remained. The Andersons left the motel at dawn, their nerves shattered and their minds reeling. They drove In silence, unable to speak of what had happened, each of them haunted by the events of the previous night. When they finally reached the nearest town, they checked into a different motel, this one bright and modern, with no history and no secrets. But the terror didn't end there. That night, in the safety of their new room, Linda awoke to find a handprint on the window, exactly like the one in room 217. "She!" screamed, waking James and Timmy. But when they turned on the light, the handprint was gone.